The church door closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. Rue stood on the steps of St. Matthias with nothing but the coat on her back and the $2.30 folded into her left boot. The snow had started sometime in the night and hadn't decided to stop yet. It came down in the steady, indifferent way that weather in northern Alberta comes down in November. Not dramatic, not cruel, just committed. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives and stays. She had nowhere to be by nightfall. That was the truth of it, plain as the grey sky above the tree line. 3 weeks ago, she'd had a room above the dry goods store on Pincher Creek Road, a position helping Mrs. Albrecht with her accounts, and the general understanding that her life, while small, was hers. Then Mr. Albrecht had come home from Fort Macleod with a nephew who needed the room and a brother-in-law who needed the job, and Rue had found herself with 2 days' notice and a handshake that was meant to feel like an apology. She'd spent the last of her money on a ticket north, following a letter from her mother's cousin that had turned out to be 2 years old by the time it reached her. The cousin had moved on. The address was a woodshed now. The Reverend at St. Matthias had let her sleep in the back room for 4 nights. On the 5th morning, he'd left a plate of bread and cold ham outside the door and knocked twice, which was his way of saying that 4 nights was the limit of Christian charity, when a vestry meeting was scheduled for Thursday. So here she was, steps of a church in a town called Dunmore, snow coming down, $2.30. She pulled the coat tighter and walked. There was a general store at the end of the main road, and beyond it the wide throat of the valley opened up, and the mountains stood in their permanent, unconcerned way. She'd heard someone in the store yesterday mention a logging camp 2 hours north. But logging camps in November were not places for women traveling alone, and she wasn't so desperate that she'd forgotten that. She stood outside the store and watched a freight wagon being loaded on the far side of the road. The man doing the loading was large, the kind of large that doesn't look like it's trying to be. He wore a heavy canvas coat and moved crates and burlap sacks the way another man might move firewood. Not struggling, just working. She watched him because she had nothing else to do, and because her feet were starting to ache in a way that meant the cold had found the gap in her right boot sole. He caught her looking. He didn't say anything. He just looked back for a moment, the way animals do when they've clocked something in their peripheral vision and decided it isn't a threat. Then he went back to loading the wagon. She went into the store and stood near the stove for as long as she could justify it. She bought a tin of sardines with 15 cents and ate them standing at the counter with a sleeve of crackers. The store owner offered without comment. He was a tired-looking man named Perch. It said so on the sign. And he had the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen enough hard luck come through his door that he'd stopped attaching stories to it. When she came back out, the wagon was almost loaded. The man was tying down a canvas tarp over the supplies, his breath coming out in short visible clouds. There was a second horse tied to the back of the wagon that she hadn't noticed before, a dark bay with a white blaze down its nose, ears flicking against the cold. She didn't mean to speak. She just did. "How far north are you headed?" He looked up. Up close, he was older than she'd thought. Somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40, with a beard gone more grey than brown, and eyes that were a colour she didn't have a word for. Not quite green, not quite brown, the kind of colour that things go in autumn, right before they're done. "Far enough," he said. It wasn't unfriendly, it was just accurate. "I heard there's a settlement up past the second ridge," she said. "Caro, or something like that. Caro's abandoned." He went back to the rope. "Has been since spring." She nodded. She'd suspected as much. She was halfway down the steps when he spoke again. "There's a woman runs a boarding house in Edgerton, hour and a half east. If that's any use to you." She turned around. "Is that where you're going?" "No." She waited. He finished the knot and looked at her again, and she got the impression he was doing the kind of quiet calculation that some people do when they've decided something, but are still working out how to say it. "I've got a place up on the Hollow Road," he said. "Half a day north. You'd be welcome to ride along as far as the Fork. And from the Fork it's a straight road east to Edgerton." "And from the Fork," she asked, "how far is that?" 3 miles. 3 miles in this snow with her boot the way it was. She didn't say that. She just looked at him. "Or," he said, and he said it the way men who don't talk much say things they've already decided, quiet and without decoration. "You could come up to the Hollow and eat something warm, and I'll drive you to Edgerton in the morning when the snow's let up." She studied him. He didn't shift under it. He just stood there by his wagon in the grey November light, waiting for her answer the same way he'd loaded those crates, without apparent urgency, without apparent doubt, as though the outcome didn't hinge on anything except what she decided. "What's your name?" she said. "Galt." She told him hers. He nodded once, the way you nod when you've filed something away. "I've got 2 horses to unhitch and settle before we go in," he said. "That'll take me 20 minutes. If you change your mind, I understand." He didn't wait for her to answer. He just started checking the harness. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat. The road north was exactly as rough as it looked from town, and worse once the trees closed in. The wagon moved through a corridor of spruce and lodgepole pine, so dense that the snow came down differently underneath. Slower, quieter, filtered through 1,000 dark branches. Galt drove with the reins loose in his hands and didn't seem to feel the need to fill the silence. Rue sat beside him, with her hands tucked into her coat sleeves, and watched the road and tried to be sensible about what she'd done. The sensible part of her brain had quite a few things to say. She knew none of them. Sut. The less sensible part of her brain noticed that he'd checked the harness on both horses before they left, and again when they stopped at a frozen creek crossing to let the animals drink from where the current kept a narrow channel open. He'd broken the ice at the edge with his boot heel before he'd let them near it. He did it without thinking. The way you do something you've done 1,000 times, automatically accounting for what the animal needs before it can tell you. She watched that and filed it away, the way you file things away when you're alone and have learned to read people from the outside in. "How long have you been up here?" she asked, somewhere past the first ridge. 7 years. Alone?" "Mostly." She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "What do you do?" "Trap. Some timber. A few things." He adjusted the reins slightly as the road bent. "Enough." She thought about what enough looked like up here, on a road that was disappearing into the trees, like it wasn't sure it wanted to be a road anymore. She thought it probably looked different than what she'd been calling enough for the last 3 years. The cabin came into view just as the light started to go grey-gold. The short November afternoon deciding it had given all it was going to give. It sat in a clearing off the main track, low and squared off against the tree line, with a woodpile stacked nearly to the roof line on the east wall, and a stone chimney that rose from it like a statement of intent. There was a small barn set back from the cabin, and a paddock with a rail fence that had been repaired so many times in different wood that it looked like a record of years. Galt stopped the wagon in front of the barn. "I'll get the horses settled," he said. "Go on in, door's not locked." "I'll help," she said. He looked at her for a moment, like he was recalibrating. "You know horses? I know enough." He thought about it, then nodded and climbed down. What followed was 20 minutes of quiet, practical work, backing the team into their stalls, pulling the harness, hanging it properly, checking feet, measuring grain, breaking the ice on the water trough, and refilling it from the pump beside the barn, which Galt primed from a hanging bucket without being asked. She did the bay mare's side. He did the grey. They didn't talk much while they did it, and that turned out to be fine. When they came out of the barn, the snow had thickened. Galt latched the barn door and stood for a moment, looking at the sky the way men who live outdoors look at the sky. Reading it, not admiring it, Coming down harder before morning, he said. Is that a problem? Not for me. He picked up a lantern from the hook beside the barn door and lit it with a match from his shirt pocket. Might change your timeline for Edgerton. She didn't say anything to that. She followed him to the cabin. Inside was plain and organized in the way that things get when one person has lived with them. Long enough to stop seeing them. There was a wood stove against the north wall, cold now, but with a good supply of split wood in the box beside it, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of canned goods and dry stores, arranged with the quiet discipline of someone who measures what they have, a coat rack by the door with 3 coats on it, all different weights, a pair of boots in the corner, resoled so many times the original leather was almost an afterthought. Galt started the fire without ceremony. He didn't comment on the cold or apologize for it. He just did the thing that needed doing. Rue stood near the stove and let the warmth start to come back into her hands and told herself to breathe normally. There's a back room, he said, still crouching at the stove. I put a cot in there last winter when my cousin came through. It's yours. Thank you, she said. He nodded and stood and went to the shelf and started pulling things down. She watched him take dried beans and set them to soak in a pot of cold water. Not to cook tonight, she noted, but to be ready for tomorrow. A man who knew how long things take. Then he pulled a cast-iron pan from its hook on the wall and set it on the stove grate, and went to the cold box in the corner and came back with a paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to be elk meat, already sliced into strips. The smell when it hit the pan was the most honest thing she'd experienced in 2 weeks. She pulled out one of the chairs and sat down. Her feet ached. The boot with the broken sole was wet through to the wool sock underneath. She became aware that she was exhausted in the specific way of people who've been keeping it together so hard that they've forgotten what not keeping it together feels like. She didn't cry. She was too tired for that. She just sat and watched the stove and listened to the meat in the pan and let the warmth come into the room. Plates are above the stove, Galt said, if you want to get them. It was practical. It was just him having both hands occupied, but it was also something else, the small act of making her part of the kitchen, giving her a job in it, which was different from being waited on, and different from being ignored. She stood up and found the plates and put them on the table. When they sat down to eat, the snow was visible through the small window above the table, falling hard in the lantern light. Inside it was warm, and it smelled like cooked meat and wood smoke, and something underneath that like pine pitch and old leather, which was just what the cabin smelled like because it was what Galt smelled like. She supposed, after 7 years of being in it. She ate without speaking for a while. You trapped in the winter too, she said eventually. Some, late winter mostly, once the ground's frozen hard enough to move through without post-holing. She didn't know what post-holing meant. She let it go. The timber, she said. Do you sell it in Dunmore? Dunmore, sometimes Edgerton. He cut a piece of meat. Depends what I've got, and who's buying. She was trying to understand the shape of a life she'd never seen up close. Not the details, the architecture of it. How a person could be so self-contained that the absence of other people seemed less like loneliness and more like a deliberate arrangement. Doesn't it? She stopped. He looked up. Sorry, she said. Never mind. Ask it. She looked at him. He said it like it was a simple thing, like ask it was just a door he was pointing at. Doesn't it get quiet? She said. To the point where it gets. She searched for the word. Heavy? He considered that for a moment, not defensively, just honestly. Sometimes, he said, mostly in March. Before the melt, she nodded. She didn't know why that made her feel better, but it did. After supper he washed the plates, and she dried them, and they put them back without discussion. He banked the fire for the night and showed her the back room, which was small and cold, and had the cot, made up with 2 wool blankets folded at the foot of it. There's another blanket on the shelf, if you need it, he said. I'll be fine, she said. He looked at her boot. There's a pair of house moccasins on the shelf as well, They'd be large on you, but they'll be warmer than what you've got. She looked down at her boot. She hadn't realized the wet was visible from the outside. "Thank you," she said. He said, "Good night," and closed the door quietly, and she sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off her boots and peeled off her socks and looked at her feet, which were red and cold and a little blistered at the right heel. She wrapped them in the dry edge of the blanket and sat there in the dark and listened to the snow on the roof. It sounded like the quietest thing she'd ever heard. In the morning the snow had stopped and left 4 inches on the ground, and a sky that had gone from grey to a high pale blue that meant cold and clarity. She could see the mountains from the back window of the cabin. Properly see them. The way you can, when the clouds have moved through, and the air is clean, and the peaks are lit white against blue, and they look like something a person drew, who had never seen anything so big, and was trying to do it justice anyway. She'd slept for 9 hours. She didn't know when she'd last done that. She found him at the stove. The beans were on, the ones he'd soaked overnight, and they were already starting to smell like something. There was coffee. She sat down, and he set a cup in front of her without asking. "Road'll be passable in a few hours," he said. "Once it's had some light on it." She wrapped both hands around the cup. Right, she thought about Edgerton. A boarding house, a new town, starting over again for the 3rd time in a year, this time with $2.15 and a coat and boots, one of which had a hole in the sole. She thought about what starting over looked like, in practical terms. Finding work, finding a room, making herself small enough to fit into whatever space was available, and useful enough that someone would let her stay in it. She drank the coffee. Galt sat down across from her with his own cup and was quiet for a moment. He was looking out the window at the mountains, the way he probably looked at them every morning. Every morning. Like they were neighbors he'd had long enough that he didn't need to say anything about them. "You could stay," he said. He said it the way he'd said everything since she'd met him, plain and without decoration. Not as a question, not quite as an invitation. More like a statement of fact that he was making available to her, the way Perch had slid the crackers across the counter without making an offer out of it. "I've got more winter than I've got help for. I'll need someone to keep the cabin up while I'm running lines. There's room. It's not much, but it's not nothing." She looked at him. He looked back. "I'm not asking for anything in return except what I said," he said. "If that needs to be said." "It doesn't," she said, and she meant it, because she'd been watching him for 18 hours now, and some things you just know by watching. She held the cup in both hands and looked out the window at the mountains and the snow and the pale winter sun coming sideways through the spruce. She thought about Edgerton. She thought about the boarding house. She thought about the road east, 3 miles from the fork, in boots with a hole in the sole. She thought about 9 hours of sleep and coffee that was already in front of her, and a man who'd unhitched his horses before he'd done anything else. "The beans," she said. "They'll be ready by noon?" He looked at the pot. "About that." She set down her cup. "Then I'll stay for lunch," she said, "and we'll see about after." He nodded once, the slow way he had. Outside, the light was coming in off the snow, and the mountains were right there, enormous and patient. The way they'd been before any of this, and the way they'd be long after. A grey jay landed on the woodpile and looked at the cabin window for a moment, suspicious and bright-eyed, and then flew off into the spruce without deciding anything. Rue picked up her coffee cup again. The beans were on. The fire was going. The road to Edgerton would still be there at noon, and afternoon, and tomorrow. She thought she might not be in any hurry to find out.